Day to be talking about is an alternative to the growth imperative. But welcome everybody, welcome to Free Word and welcome to this evening's conversation. Victoria Waldersee from Rethinking Economics is going to be chairing us through with a brilliant panel of speakers. But I just wanted to say a big welcome from Free Word. I'm Rose Fenton, the director of Free Word, and we describe ourselves as an international centre for literature, literacy and free expression. The free expression is a very important part of it. And what we do is to explore and celebrate the power of words to change lives, and words in all their guises, to give a platform for the voices that don't get heard enough. And we're very much in the tradition of this area for literature, pamphleteering and dissent. So that's all very important to us. I should just say a few words about this event. It's part of a series we're doing called Unravelling Europe, and the sense of what is happening in Europe. How can we unravel what is happening in Europe today at a time of huge uncertainty and fear, when all the values that we hold dear, whether it's around human rights, free expression, tolerance, diversity, are under threat. And what are the consequences of them being under threat? And how can we actually act to stop that happening? So we're looking at different aspects of our society in Europe today, whether it's around economics or whether it's around cultural diversity, and actually trying to understand what the issues are. But very importantly, we want to put at the heart of the conversation the cultural perspective, the voice of the artist, of the writer, of the poet, who will be alongside the experts. But actually, what does that bring? Because what we do at Free Word is bring together culture and politics. And too often, the cultural perspective is left out. And, you know, there are all sorts of economic solutions or military solutions even to the problems. But where is the artist's voice? And so that's what we hope we can bring today alongside some amazing specialists from economics, from environment, and as others, as you will hear. So welcome to the Unravelling and Restitching Europe. It's not just about Brexit, it's about the bigger issues. Of course, Brexit is important. And welcome to this evening. And Victoria, over to you.
Thanks, Rose. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name's Victoria. I'm part of Rethinking Economics, and we're really happy to be co-hosting this event with the Free Word. For those of you who don't know, Rethinking Economics is a network which started off as a network of students calling for reform in the way that economics is taught at universities, trying to bring about a discipline that is less abstract and more grounded in the real world, grounded in the way that we live our lives and the values that we hold. We've moved from curriculum reform now more and more into public education, as well as we saw that the problem with this discipline ranged actually beyond just the university classroom and into the way that economics is talked about in the media, in politics, and just the perceptions, and the perceptions that we all hold of this word. And I'm currently working on a project which is just called Economy. You can find us on ecnmy.org, just economy without the O's. And it's all about just trying to take this word and turn it into just something that is really about how we all live our lives. And I think the reason why I'm personally really interested in this event is that this question of the growth imperative and what growth is, I think faces a lot of the same problems that the word economy and economics does, in that it's almost like a word that previously was just about the way we lead our lives has been co-opted into a term that is linked to all sorts of values that not everyone necessarily agrees with. And that's why we asked those of you who are here today to maybe share just your ideas of this word growth. So you'll all have had a card on your seats, which has the question of what does growth mean to you? And I'd be really happy if perhaps before we go into the panel discussion, we could just hear some of your thoughts about what this word is before we talk about whether there's an alternative to it. What does it actually mean to us? I don't know if anyone would like to share, or perhaps if you take a minute to just talk to the person next to you, and then I will ask a couple of you to share, if you're willing, what this word means. So if you take growth, just growth. Oh God, good for time. such a good time. Okay. For time's sake, I'm really sad to stop this now. If I could have your attention. No, I can't have their attention. No, that's it. Should we just make this for the event? I'm really sad to break this up now because you're all having really interesting conversations. But I'm really glad that started so much conversation. Can I ask maybe just 2 or 3 people to share, and then afterwards when we do the Q&A, a couple more of you could share your answers. Is anyone willing to volunteer? Yeah. I think a microphone's coming.
It may be a sign of my age, perhaps, but for me, the primary meaning of it now is sort of an internal thing. It's personal development. It's what happens in here.
That's really interesting. Anyone else have a similar idea of that word? Yeah.
Well, we kind of said that we were talking about the opposite, which is that kind of relentless pressure on organisations to get bigger and to do more and to innovate and to always scale up.
Yeah.
That was the word we talked about.
That's really interesting. One more person, maybe? Yeah, here at the front.
Well, if you thinking of growth in terms of the natural world, primary example would be of a tree growing from being a seed to a sapling to a fully mature one, and then eventually sort of getting blasted by lightning and sickening and dying and becoming eaten up by the fungi.
Great. But I do think that's really interesting. We've just asked 3 people and had 3 completely different ideas of what this is, from the personal perspective to the kind of organizational perspective to just the natural perspective. So thank you, that's great, and hopefully we can hear some more of your ideas at the end. So our first speaker is not physically with us here today, but she is Yuan Yang. Yuan is one of the co-founders of the Rethinking Economics Network that I'm part of, and she's also an active poet. And she's written a poem for us this evening, which is sort of her response to this question of what growth means. So we're all just going to hear that to start the evening off.
Good evening, Free Word Centre. My name's Yuan. I'm a writer, a poet, and a journalist. 3 years ago, I was also an organiser. I was one of the students who started up the community Rethinking Economics, which is an international movement to challenge and transform economics education in and outside of the university. I'm really glad that I have the chance to speak to you this evening because I'm actually 10,000 kilometres away in Hong Kong. I'm here with the Financial Times as their new China economics correspondent. I was asked to write about the topics of economic growth and the limits to growth, and so this is my poem titled On Growth. When you're 50, go wherever you like. The Chinese will be as rich as the Americans, and I'll be on my pension or dead, he said. I thanked him for the advice and left his office. I thought of how my children, maybe your children, would be born without that striving sense that life is better elsewhere in the West. I only want to go where you can grow too. All I want is a city you'd be old with me in. All I need is a bed. Imagine what humans would have done if the shade didn't draw us back daily. Imagine what lack of love would be left. When I'm 50, I'll have loved you for half of my life. My baby cousins will be getting married, and their mothers won't worry about the in-laws' salaries. We'll all be as rich as the Americans, and that's the end of that, I hope. We'll be as full. as a monk who puts his mouth to the stream that flows ceaselessly will be as complete as his closing his lips, licking the droplets, and taking his leave. May I grow to slake every thirst I possess, except for you. May life come as easily to our children as water to the lips. May they know when to dip their heads and when to lift.
Shame she can't be here tonight, but I imagine she's probably watching. So if you have any questions, I'm sure you could actually direct them to her across the oceans. So to the panel that is here with us today, we're really excited about just the range of speakers that we have here. We're going to start with Kate Rayworth, who is Senior Visiting Research Associate at Oxford University's Environmental Change Institute. Kate is currently focusing on exploring the economic mindset that we need to challenge to address the 21st century's social and ecological challenges, and has a really interesting framework of her own with which to do that. So over to Kate.
Thank you. Okay, so Victoria asked everybody, how do you think about growth? And I'm just going to jump in and talk about how economists think about growth typically. If you could pop up the slide for me, I've got a couple of slides to show. Is it coming? Well, you know how economists think about growth. They think about economic growth, GDP growth. And GDP is the value of all goods and services sold in the economy in a year. Oh, it's not there yet. And if you look at this chart, which is about to appear, over time, it's grown exponentially. It's a very particular kind of growth. So over hundreds of years, first you see almost nothing happening, and then suddenly it took off, particularly around 1950 on the global scale. In fact, the global economy has quadrupled in size since around 1970 alone. That's the year I was born. So it's 4 times bigger in value from the year I was born. And if you believe mainstream predictions, it's going to be around 4 times bigger again. Oh, that's not it. It's going to be around 4 times bigger again by 2050. So, in fact, an economy that's growing 3% a year would double in size every 23 years. That's just how exponentials work. Now, the shape of that economy, in fact, because that slide's not going to come, Stuart has agreed not only to lend me a hand, he's going to lend me his arm for the evening. So could you just give me an exponential growth curve? No, that way. There we are. Right. That is beautiful sample of exponential growth, right? It just goes up and up and up and up. Anything that's growing at 3% or 5% is going to do that over time. And if Stuart's fingers were long enough, you know where they go. They go right up through the ceiling, right? That shape... You can put it down for a moment, thank you. That shape actually is deeply comforting to us because the shape of growth lies in our language. It's in our metaphors. Anyone who's raised a child knows that the most exciting thing that happens is they start to crawl. And first they go backwards, but then they go forwards. And then they crawl forward, and then they pull themselves up. So this sense of forward and up is deeply rooted in our sense of progress as humanity. And when you think of those little pictures you see of ourselves evolving from being apes to man, it's always a sort of crouched ape standing up to a man, walking forwards. So we have a very deeply rooted metaphor. And in fact, George Lakoff and Mark Johnson in 1980 did a wonderful book called Metaphors We Live By. And one of the primary orientational metaphors is that forward is good and up is good. So, you know, things are looking up, come on, onwards and upwards. So no wonder this picture of growth looks so natural to us. It's so compelling. But as the gentleman here said, nothing in nature grows forever. In fact, nothing that we can think of grows forever. So Stuart's arm was going up, but it would be quite weird if his fingers were that long to go through the ceiling. You'd be worried for him, right? My children, who are age 7, their feet are growing incredibly fast. Great. They're getting taller, but I really hope it stops because otherwise, you know, they won't be able to sit at the kitchen table. Anything that is growing hopefully comes to a stop, otherwise it's deeply unnatural. And sometimes people say, cancer grows forever. Not even cancer grows forever. Cancer kills its host, and then that forces it to stop. In fact, everything comes to a halt. So let's have that lovely exponential curve again. There we are. So with a small flip of the hand, there's exponential growth, and with a small flip of the arm, This is what's called logistic growth. It grows, and it goes through this big growth phase, but then it plateaus. It levels off. And that's what the tree does. It grew from a little seed, shooting up through sapling, and then it matured. And of course, in the end, as the gentleman described, it died and went back, and it would come up again. This gentleman's personal development, thinking about our personal intellectual, it grows, and then we plateau. The business that you work for, it's trying to scale up, but at some point, it's going to plateau. Everything reaches that plateau and then ultimately dies. So to me, a really interesting question that economists are far too scared to ask. Can I have that lovely? Where are we on this curve? In Britain, in China, in the United States? Are we here? We always talk as if we're here. Growth ahead. The politicians want the growth ahead. They talk as if we're down here and there's this great spurt to come. Technology, the digital revolution, we've got this great spurt to come. What happens if we're actually here? What happens if actually we're at the point where things are getting ready to plateau? If you look at the if you look at the OECD's predictions, it sounds quite plateau. Growth prospects are very mediocre, 1%. Oh, there it is, there it is. So that's looking incredibly optimistic. But if you look, say, within the OECD or in Europe, a lot of countries are projected to have 1%, sometimes 0%, very slow growth. So you can hear in language of governments, they're already starting to talk, they call it mediocre prospects, but it's basically very slow growth. Not yet ready to countenance that might be leading to what you'd call no growth. What happens if you have an economy that you don't actually know where you are on that curve, because we don't? You've got a real problem if you've got an economy that is getting ready to stop growing, but everything that's designed within that economy assumes it will always keep growing. And that is where I believe we are. I don't know that we're getting ready to stop growing, but if we're an economy that might come to stop growing, and yet it's been geared for about the past 80 years by the structure of business, by finance, by government, and by social expectations to expect, demand, and depend upon unending growth, then you've really got a problem. That's when you have governments that say we have to have trade liberalizations and cut back some of the so-called red tape. Actually, that red tape that opens up trade and increases exports and promotes growth, in other words, that red tape was once called workers' rights or environmental protection or health and safety standards. Or you can commodify and monetize the living world and create ecosystem services, and perhaps you can create bonds and trading in these areas, which I know Nick has thought a great deal about. So there is ways you can try and squeeze growth out of a system that doesn't seem to be growing otherwise, but we might think that those are ways that we don't want to live, and perhaps that system needs to learn to stop growing. So for me, a fundamental question or fundamental challenge is this: we have an economy now that needs to grow, whether or not that makes us thrive because of the way it's structured. But what we need is an economy that makes us thrive whether or not it's growing. So we've got an economy that needs to grow whether or not it makes us thrive. We need an economy that makes us thrive whether or not it's growing. And to me, one of the most exciting and challenging questions for 21st century economists is to think, what would it take to restructure business, finance, government, and society so that we could have an economy that allowed us to thrive whether or not it was growing? That's never really been asked before. I only know of Caroline Lucas, the Green MP, who's the only person who's ever willing, as a politician, to talk about the possibility of living in an economy that's not growing. No other politicians were willing to do it. And if any university graduate goes to work either in politics or in the media or in government or in business or in international institutions, you almost get on your name badge, you're for green growth, we're pro-growth, and there's almost no intellectual space for thinking about the need for an alternative. So we need to think about, how could you have business that wasn't driven by shareholder maximization? How could you have finance that wasn't driven by having to have a positive interest rate? Could you have government that didn't have to grow forever to increase its tax revenues because it wanted to keep taxes low? Could you have a society that didn't expect increasing incomes and create its own consumer identity on consumerism, that we could take this growth drive out of all these structures that we've got? I believe it could be done, but it's a hell of a task, a real major challenge to the 21st century, not something easy to say, dismiss growth and I'm all for degrowth. It's a huge challenge, just as challenging as trying to imagine an economy that could keep on growing and keep on growing. We're really caught in a paradigm shift moment between two different systems that it's very hard to imagine quite what either of them would look like successfully. And for me, one of the changes that we need to make is the way we envision progress. So that's the old vision of progress that we've had for the last, say, 80 years since GDP was first measured in the 1930s. So I'm trying to think of what would a new vision look like? How could we draw for ourselves, going back to the days where when we were children, we looked at picture books and we looked at drawings and they deeply influenced us. I think they still deeply influence us. So I've tried to come up with another picture that could help us shift patterns. So if you could pop the second picture up. Drum roll. Oh, there it is. Okay, if you can see that. So that is not a rising line. That's a donut. I call it a donut, not because it's junk food. It might just be the one donut that's any good for us. On the outside, the eco donut. On the outside are what's called the 9 planetary boundaries created by a group of Earth system scientists who said, what are the critical Earth system processes that we need to protect if we're going to keep Earth in the stable, incredible stable state that it's been in for the last 10,000 years, giving us fresh air, fertile soil, clean water, a protective ozone layer, bountiful biodiversity. And they came up with these 9 planetary boundaries that we mustn't put so much pressure on that we kick the planet out of this stable state. And to that I added the inner circle, which are essentially critical human rights that every person in the world has a claim upon realizing. Many of them require resources: food, water, education, jobs, energy, being resilient with social equality and gender equality. So to me, the challenge for the 21st century is to bring ourselves into the green space of the donut so that nobody is left in the space in the middle of deprivation, but we don't go over the planetary boundaries into environmental degradation. Of course, at the moment, millions of people live in that space of deprivation in the middle, and we're way over many of those planetary boundaries of climate change, biodiversity, nitrogen and phosphorus use, and land system change. So we need to come into that space from both sides simultaneously. We have never done it before. Yeah, I'll stop 1 minute. So I draw pictures. I've realized that I find pictures very, very powerful as a means of communicating. You can tell I'm grabbing Stuart's arm and lines. But I think it taps into something very deep in our heads. And I'm writing a book about this at the moment. It's called Donut Economics, 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist. And for each of those 7 ways, I think there's a real mind shift. And I'm so excited to be here tonight, but also in the future opportunities of working with verbal artists and visual artists. How can we draw and speak and poet and rhyme this new vision of a paradigm that we need to create?
Thanks very much. Thank you. So I'm really glad Kate has done half of Nick's introduction for me and that she's made that link between this economic model and just the literary, the visual, the artistic world. We're really happy to be joined by Nick today. Nick is a writer, a journalist and storyteller who writes about just the impact that climate change has on our cultures and our beliefs. So please go ahead.
One of the pointers I was given was to say a bit about what I feel the role of writers is in sparking conversation about alternatives to growth. And it made me think, well, first of all, it made me think how reluctant I am to speak about the role of writers in any given situation, partly because I can't pretend to speak for all of them. But also it made me realize that sometimes ascribing utilitarian roles for writing and art isn't very helpful. Auden had the line, "Poetry makes nothing happen." It's immensely frustrating for anyone that wants to see results. And growth is obsessed with results and things you can measure, things you can quantify, things you can write numbers about. It's impossible to measure or quantify the value of writing. It's mostly produced by people who have very little economic benefit to them through the act of doing it, as is all art. Often the economic benefit is just tangential, and often it doesn't produce any results at all. It isn't always useful. It doesn't always do a job, and that's kind of the point. I think talking about a possible role of writers, having said all that, it may not even be suggesting a concrete alternative, but I think one of the most important things that we as a group can do is to remind people continually that growth is a story, it's a narrative, it's a certain way of framing events. And what Kate was saying about that model of evolution, of like the kind of hobbling monkey developing into a big striding man, being deeply locked into our psyches. Again, that's the story. It's a way of seeing history and progress. The idea of economic growth as being this kind of holy grail of a political objective isn't that old. It goes back to sometime after World War II. But it does follow on very perfectly, really, from other ideas that are deep in our heads. The narrative of perpetual Western industrial and technological progress, the myth of human progress itself, this idea, as Kate said, that we all started out as kind of blobs of slime, and then we developed to banging rocks together in a cave. And then one day we'll be living in the workers' paradise, or we will be uploading our consciousness onto the cloud and having ourselves replaced by nanobotic devices. Even the Big Bang itself is really a narrative of endless expansion. It's why we understand it. We start small and we get bigger. It's that simple. It's a very simple, linear A to B narrative. And in this way, that the story of economic growth can be told as if it's part of the natural order. It's just, it's programmed that things will get bigger. But it's good to be reminded that things also go backwards, and they go up and down, and they go around in circles. Again, Kate's image of the donut illustrates that really nicely. The narrative of unquestioned growth and expansion, what someone called relentless pressure a minute ago to get bigger. This has obviously become unstuck in many ways. A lot of people have stopped believing in this story. I grew up in the 90s with this idea that the EU was just this thing that was going to expand and expand. That seemed like the natural way of things, and that's clearly far from inevitable now. A few years ago, famously, there was a poll in the US that suggested that for the first time since the war, young people believed they would not be richer than their parents' generation, that they would grow up poorer. The Guardian's just been doing this whole series about millennials and how economically screwed they all are, unable to afford property or to get a pension. And this is a total reversal of the post-war narrative that we've all been brought up on of growth and progress. And it doesn't really matter whether it's true. There's many ways to spin these numbers. The point is that people have stopped believing it. This narrative is now in crisis. And this made me think of Donald Trump. I'm sorry I have to bring him up in a nice, pleasant evening. But it's completely understandable. The thing that really jumped out at one of his speeches that I forced myself to watch was, we're going to take and take and take and take. And to people that grew up with this narrative of perpetual progress, the dream, and then saw that narrative hit the wall of reality and realized that their country wasn't as big and as strong and as all-powerful as they thought, and that they were going to grow up poorer than their parents' generation. A guy standing up and basically saying, fuck reality, we can be the biggest, the best, the strongest, the greatest. That's such a simple appeal. Again, it's that A to B narrative. It's the Big Bang. We start small and we end up really, really, really big. It's a story totally stripped of any nuance and complexity and subtlety. And that's why it's such a powerful one to people that are angry and frustrated. But single stories are extremely dangerous things. I think it was John Michael Greer who said, never again will one story be told as if it's the only one. Telling different types of story is clearly very important, a refusal to believe in the lie that there's only one way of seeing the world. I want to just say something quickly about this short story that's been alluded to before. I'm going to read a very short section of. I was asked to write this for a Tipping Point commission last year. The story is called Green Bang, and I wanted to explore this narrative of growth, of the idea of natural capital. And for people that aren't familiar with that term, it's basically this totally neoliberal approach to the environment, to saving the world, that's being championed by a lot of people calling themselves eco-modernists or neo-greens. And basically every part of the natural world is seen in terms of its economic usefulness to humans, or specifically the human economy. So forests aren't forests anymore, they're carbon sinks. Pollinating insects become ecosystem service providers. You can buy derivatives like carbon credits and forest habitat credits and biodiversity credits and trade them just like any other asset on free market. Again, this narrative goes right back through human history, which is why it's appealing to a lot of people. It's the same idea that has God giving man stewardship of the earth and putting man at the very top of the tree of life with everything else underneath him. This idea of valuing a mountain, not for its intrinsic mountainness, but as a piece of natural capital, an economic asset that has to justify its continued existence in terms of which services it provides to the human economy. It just seems so fundamentally and instinctively wrong. It's such a clearly psychopathic vision of the world that it was hard to know where to start. But the starting point was language, biodiversity offsetting, wetland banking, natural capital. I wanted to see what happened if I took that language and used it to build a world and then see how that world felt and how people interacted in that world. So it's set a very short time in the future when the narrative of natural capital has become the world's dominant story, the world's single story. The main character is an ex-ecosystem services trader who's had a breakdown of his marriage, he's had a personal breakdown, and he's trying very unsuccessfully to rekindle a relationship with his 9-year-old daughter. It was a warm autumn day, and the ecosystem service providers were buzzing in the natural capital. The foliage was consuming the light. Anders was sitting in his usual chair. Sophie and Sasha were on their way, and this afternoon he would go with Sasha to an area of outstanding natural beauty to forge a closer familial connection while recreationally walking. So they go for this recreational walk and attempt to forge a closer familial connection. And the father attempts to explain this new world to his daughter. Sasha, yes, her solemnity grew, as if she sensed they were nearing that time, one of those adult conversations she'd probably learned to dread already. A siren whooped once far away. She sat there very still. There was a time before you were born when a tree was just a tree. That's all it was, just that. And it was the same for other things. A mountain, a waterfall, and a blade of grass were once just a mountain, a waterfall, and a blade of grass. A bee was once just a bee. There was no reason for them. She gazed at him with worried eyes. He knotted his hands on the picnic table and concentrated on the words, on simplifying the complexity. And even longer before you were born, before there were any bees or dinosaurs or single-celled organisms or anything else you might have heard about, the world itself, the planet we live on, that had no reason either. It was only a ball of minerals waiting for something to happen to it, for something to give it meaning. Then people came along, and for a long time they had no meaning either. They just happened to exist like all the other things. But eventually people learned how to value each other. And then they learned how to value the world around them, the trees, the waterfalls, the bees, the very planet they lived on. Everything was given a purpose that it didn't have before. Now, nothing exists for no reason. Everything is working together. It's a functioning part of a system that makes people happier. Of course, things go up and down. That's part of the natural cycle. You'll understand that someday. But the world has gained a kind of reason, just like people once did. Sasha, do you know what value is? It wasn't a question, and she didn't answer. It's another word for meaning. The higher the value, the higher the meaning. The meaning of the world is the value of the world, all its units added up, its leaves, its blades of grass, its reserves and its carbon sinks, its networks, systems, processes, everything together. Anders took a steadying breath. His hands felt rather far away, and something was happening to his eyes, a familiar throbbing. Sasha hadn't spoken, hadn't moved. Wind energy was stirring the trees, rustling the natural capital. Everything would be all right. Sasha, value is the same as love. How can we love what has no value? That is to say, what I mean, the phenomenon was occurring again. Water was coming from his eyes, turning the world into rainbow prisms, yet once again he did not feel sad. Instead, he felt quite elated. He wiped and snorted and managed to say, "I value you very much," before covering up his face and breathing wetly into his hands. He stayed that way for a while. So stop there? Okay. Yeah, that's fine.
Thank you
Thanks.
so much. So now we turn to Stuart, another speaker we're really excited to have here tonight. Stuart has been with the New Economics Foundation for a very long time and has worked in the World Bank and Rio Tinto and has just a wealth of experience talking about growth. You do. And I know that you've spoken a lot about values in your work, and this is something that has come up quite a lot, so it'd be really great to hear from you how you think that plays into this discussion.
Thanks. And one apology, I'm going back to Devon tonight because I've got a dentist appointment at 8 in the morning in the far northwest coast of Devon. So I've got to leave here literally at 1:45 on the dot, otherwise I won't get the train. So huge apologies. So I may have to disappear off even before we finish the discussion. I'm so sorry. If one goes, I'll come to values in a minute, but if one goes to the Museum of the History of Science in Florence, there's an amazing machine there which was created either in the 13th or 14th century, which represents the solar system as people saw it then, and the Earth is at the center. And you crank a crank, and it shows you the orbit of Mars and Venus. And Venus goes something like that. And when you turn the crank, it's the most amazing bit of kit. But of course, it's total rubbish. It was all based on the idea that everything went round the Earth. And we are literally at a Galileo Copernicus moment now. We've got an economy, I think people have described it very well already, but I call it the 4 U's. It's fine, apart from it's unsustainable, it's unfair, it's unstable, and it's making far too many people unhappy. And a few other things as well. So I won't go into that. But critically, we need a major system shift. Kate's already referred to it, Nick's pointed to it as well, which requires a real rethinking, not just of economics, but of, I call it a values revolution. Because I think without a values revolution, we're not going to shift. We're not going to get, I can write beautiful essays about all the changes you need, but the big burning question is, how do these shifts happen? And when we look at shifts before in human history, whether it's the anti-slavery movement or the civil rights movement, or even the 2 big shifts in economic systems in the 20th century, first to Keynesianism with a much greater focus on the role of government and solidarity, and then to neoliberalism with much greater focus on the individual. You see really 3 things that are necessary in each of those cases. First, a compelling news story. It has to be a positive story, not just what's wrong with the old story. Secondly, that there's a vanguard or a movement of people across all sorts of different sectors who know things are wrong and prepared to work together. And thirdly, a values shift. And you've seen that in many cases. I mean, even in the neoliberals' case, there was a value being pushed all the time, falsely, I think, but a value of liberty was the one being used. So we've got to talk in terms of a values revolution as well as an economics revolution. And I've been working with not the most usual body, a group of people from the World Economic Forum. They're not from, but they're drawn from all sorts of different backgrounds, different faiths, different nationalities. There's 20 of us, put together with the idea of saying, are there some common values we should be striving for? Or are they all culturally determined? And we came up with a very simple, when you looked at different civilizations, you looked at different faiths, there are very clearly some common values that we need to be striving for again. And the way we express them, there's many different ways of expressing them. They're very simply human dignity, and that's both rights and responsibilities. The idea that all our institutions should be working for the common good, and stewardship. Now, those sound all very fluffy and simple and obvious. But if you just designed an economic system around those, you would have to do something very different. You'd have to meet the basic needs, and those aren't just economic, they're psychological, security-wise, of every single human being on the planet. That human dignity demands that. You'd have to move from an anthropocentric view of the planet to a biocentric view, stewardship, in effect, and living within ecological means demands that. You'd have to have a system that's much fairer, and you'd have to have as your key goal human flourishing or well-being, not the maximization of GDP or anything like that. Now, those values are very simple to say, but they require a major system shift in every way. But interestingly, when I talk, I keep thinking about various Davoses I've been to, I'm going to be asked to leave after them, because I'm always talking about how we need to, do an economic revolution and all the different. But sometimes I get through to people, sometimes not. The stuff on well-being translates very well. But when we talk to people about values, it's very interesting. That resonates almost with everybody. And then when you actually get to talking about what they're doing, and is that commitment to their values, what you often see is a lot of people actually, even people you think who are very powerful, actually feel trapped by the system they're in. And that's why we need the type of people you got here. We need people across all sorts of walks of life helping imagine a new story, and why we need a movement for change where instead of playing our own instruments as we need to do to all sorts of different scores in lots of different orchestras, we need some common scores. And we've got to find, and that's part of a value shift as well. So the imagining, as Kate says, we don't know what this world is going to be. I can give you some of the building blocks, but we don't actually know. We've got to imagine it and find out. But I think we know the goals, and I think we know, which are some of those things I've said. We know some of the values that need to be there. We know some of the principles. And if we could operate at that level and create the new institutions we need, create the new vision, create a really positive, compelling vision, because, I've gone on for a long time telling everybody how they're, if we carry on with climate change, we're going to be fried, burnt, crisped, etc. But it doesn't actually take you very far, It's sort of, so it's actually creating a positive vision of a world, and we haven't found the right language yet, and language is terribly important, and this again is something we need to work on together. I sometimes talk about good lives that don't cost the earth, but that still doesn't quite do it. But we have to find a compelling new language to sum up this world that we're leading to, and to inspire people. And enough of us who know that things are wrong and want to change it have to start working together. So we've got to break out of, I come from civil society background, so I've worked for Oxfam before, New Economics Foundation, then business and World Bank way back. But we have to find not just, civil society. When you look at the more progressive movement, we're often speaking with dissonant voices. We're focused too much on policies, not enough on values and principles. But we need to be working with the cultural sector. We need to be working with faith groups that believe that. We need to be working with research and policy people, with academic. We've got to find people who know things on whatever sectors they work in have got to come together. It's absolutely crucial. The New Economics Foundation's been working on something called New Economy Organisers Network, but that's just one bit of the picture. So my fundamental thing is we need a values revolution, we need a new story, and we've got to work together. And there's lots of things that will change. We need probably a basic income for every human being. We need to rethink the global commons. We need to rethink work. We've focused, so much on labor productivity. We don't want the Chicago Symphony Orchestra to be more productive. I don't want who cares for me in my old age to be more productive. I want more, so we've got to rethink the whole picture. I mean, it's as big as that. It's as exciting as that, but it's scary stuff. But can we do it? Yes, we can.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So we'll all leave tonight with quite a big to-do list, but I hope you're all ready to take that challenge. So our last but not least, we're going to hear from Johanna Nijman. We're really glad to have Johanna here as a really amazing young voice, and that she's the president of the European Youth Forum and currently works at the Environmental Justice Foundation here in London. Thanks, Johanna.
Thank you very much for having me. So I'm going to take over
on the challenge.
Yeah, where you left it. We need to rethink this whole system, and we have to look ourselves in the mirror. And what we see right now in Europe, but also across the Atlantic, it's fear. A lot of people are governed by fear. And I think this fear, it comes from the unsustainable development that our societies have been going through. A lot of empty promises that people see is not really delivered on, promises that we don't actually get something out of. And this gives the space to fear, and who follows in the steps of fear, I think we have seen them in a lot of countries across Europe, but also in the US at this moment. And it's not the future I want to see. And I think many of you agree with me on that. I think the first step, what we have to do in order to combat fear, is come up with this narrative, this positive story of saying, where do we want to go? But to be able to do that, we have to see things for what they really are. And I think it's important not only to talk in the big ideas sphere, but to really see the things for what they are. And when it comes to environment, we know the state of the climate, we know that our resources are ending, but we have to see what are the concrete stories that we can pick up, and what are the things that are really happening out there. One very concrete thing is the fish are disappearing. We're overfishing. I'm originally from Finland, and the Baltic Sea, first the fish started to shrink, and now they start to disappear. We've been fishing too much and polluting too much. It's happening to a greater scale also out in the big seas. So, for example, outside of Thailand, the fish have been decreasing by 86% since the 60s. So it's not even that many years, but we've been fishing it away and shipping it off, mostly of it going to Europe and to the US. And what happens when there's no fish, but there's a very big demand for consumption and an even bigger demand for lower prices, is that there is a lot of human abuse in the other end of the scale, meaning the people who are fishing those fish are severely abused, a lot of forced bonded slave labor, human rights abuses. And that is the reality coming from our growth and our excessive consumption. The second thing is climate change. We all know what's happening, but we don't stop. The government in the country where I come from, Finland, just took a decision to, in order to enlarge our economy, they want to start digging up and burning all the peat in the country, meaning destroying the local ecosystems, but also meaning releasing even more carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere, creating more global warming. So this is the reality of what is happening. And when it comes to young people and our possibilities, you already mentioned it. Well, you saw probably in The Guardian, Generation Y and our prospects. In Europe right now, we had 23% of young people being unemployed with no prospects. No future. I mean, it's a lot of young people who are angry, but even more young people who are apathetic, sad, saying, why should I try if there are no possibilities? We'll never have the possibility of buying a house. That is a utopia. The good thing is if you can actually land a job, and if you get a job, what kind of job is it? It's not something you would call a quality job. It's unpaid internships, it's shitty working hours, it's 0-hour contracts, and the possibilities to actually have some kind of stability and to then think about the next steps of building your life, maybe having a family, having a stable future is not really there. So this is the reality, and then we have to ask ourselves, how does this relate to growth? Well, many times when we talk about youth unemployment, for example, the promises we get is growth, and this will create jobs. And this is the way also our generation will be a part of the well-being we have had in Europe this far. For young people, we also have at the moment a lot of migrants coming to Europe, refugees knocking on the door to Europe, and they are not let in because there is a fear that we have too little to share, which is not the reality. We have a lot to share, but there needs to be a genuine will to redistribute between generations and between groups in society. And this will is lacking at the moment, and I think a narrative should be built also around this, about the values of sharing and caring about each other. So the question is, how can our generation get access to the welfare without growth? And that is a very difficult question. The easy answer is, let's go upwards. More. And just to round up, the question is also about Europe, because here right now it's a very heated debate. It's interesting to follow it also as a European. I cannot vote in the upcoming referendum, but of course eagerly following the discussion. And I think Europe is very important, not because of the pensions or because of of the visas or because of the economic growth, but Europe is important because we share values. And Europe is a way of cooperating across borders, because I don't think we solve the question of economic growth or sustainability by sitting in a village somewhere and making a collective decision. We have to reach out and we have to make a decision amongst as many people as possible, because that is how we can truly change the reality we live in. So it's identifying our values and making sure that as many people as possible share those and work for those collectively.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just another round of applause for all of our speakers. And Stuart, do you have to?
I have to go. Sadly.
Okay,
I'd love to
unfortunately. Thank you so much for joining us.
It'd be far more enjoyable to stay than rushing back to the dentist.
We wish you the best of luck.
Good luck at the dentist.
Any function of growth in dentists.
Because
Flourishing.
Keynes said he hoped that one day economists would be as humble as dentists. So maybe you're going to be the first
Maybe
one.
that's it, yes.
Thank you. Okay, so now's the time to open up the conversation. I think we've had a lot of questions raised here and a lot of ideas shared, and I know that some of you had some more thoughts perhaps just about this idea of growth. I think we can probably agree on this side here that there does need to be an alternative to the growth imperative, and I'd be really interested to just hear what your ideas on that might be, as well as any questions you have for the panel. So does anyone have anything they'd like to share? Yeah, here. Just one sec, there's a microphone. Thanks.
Thank you. So sort of restructuring a whole system away from growth, will that also require restructuring or slow down in growth in other areas like human population?
Would you like to direct your question to a certain member of the panel or just anybody? Kate?
Yes, yes, I think it does. I think so. People are frightened of talking about population. It's a really tense subject, because the minute you start talking about whether or not it matters how big the population is, if you don't talk about it, people think you're completely ignoring it. And if you talk about it, people think you want to control their families. So it's very tricky. The way I think about it is this, and if I had Stuart's arm here, I would show you all over his arm. See, population is doing exactly this. If you look at the global human population, it's been through an extraordinary growth spurt, but it is coming to a plateau. Of course, it matters where it comes to that plateau, whether it plateaus at 9 billion or 10 billion or 11 billion, but it's coming to a plateau. And the brilliant thing about it is that in the past, when if you saw a graph of when human population the rate had gone up and down, in the past, the times when the population growth rate slowed, it was always due to disaster. Chinese famine, post-World War, global epidemics. For the first time in human history, the global population is slowing down and coming to a halt due to success. And the great success is girls' education, child's health, women's empowerment, women's access to contraception, women's empowerment in jobs. It essentially means that women have been able to take control of their bodies, their children are surviving, and when a woman can take control of her own family, scale that out, the global population starts to slow down, and people prefer to have 2 children rather than large families. So for me, I really agree that population matters, and I think people should stop being afraid to talk about it. It matters, but it's not the one that keeps me awake at night because it's doing this. The one that keeps me awake at night is GDP growth, because it's still doing this. It's on an exponential curve where the population's plateauing due to the natural forces of humans succeeding, thank goodness. But we need to. But when a population is still growing, and people wanting to move into Europe, of course there are pressures for the economy to keep growing. Otherwise, you're sharing a fixed resource between more people. And in fact, when populations do grow, the economy grows because you're bringing in something called labour, this extraordinary resource that gets to work. So a growing population tends to make the economy grow. It's another reason why we should think of a slower growth economy, because in countries where population is slowing down, there's fewer new bodies coming in as workers, it's going to slow the economic growth rate down too.
I think from all the panel, it seems that there is an alternative to the growth imperative. But as Nick said, when you look at somebody like Trump at the moment, you have an absolutely linear narrative which says growth, growth, growth. And that has been something that, for most of us, has informed our thinking since we were small. You know, the idea is to go from that crawl to the walk, is to get bigger, is all of those things. How do we change that narrative? How do we move from trying to convince people that actually more isn't better to actually accepting that if we want the world to be a better place, then we are going to have to accept that less is better?
Yeah.
I don't have, that's to everyone, I don't have anyone specific.
No, that's fine. Would anyone like to pick up? I mean, I have some. Go on.
Yeah, just something that just jumped out at me is the idea of growth of what? That's what we need to we could have growth of empathy, growth of kindness, growth of sharing, growth of redistribution. We just got this, everyone's got this idea in their heads that growth is just getting richer. And I think it is, there's cracks in the story. Increasingly in recent, there's books about like affluenza and kind of things that actually look at, like Stuart said, unhappiness. Why if this narrative works, why are people in rich societies unhappy? That shouldn't happen according to this theory. That doesn't make sense according to the narrative. And I think this is causing people to question. So I guess the only kind of solution I can think of is allowing the space for these questions and different types of story to emerge. I don't think it necessarily takes 10 or 20 visionary geniuses to be putting out these ideas. I think people already have these questions in their heads. People are probably starting to retell their own stories. So more encouragement of that.
Yeah,
that's one thing.
If I can just abuse my position as chair for 1 second. I think just the really interesting question you asked there is just how do you create a new narrative, right? And I think just from the perspective of rethinking economics, I know that a large part of the reason why I joined this student movement was because when I studied economics at university, just on like the second, third lesson that I had, we were looking at just the assumptions of neoclassical economics, which is the kind of economic school of thought that you learn the most about in a typical economics degree. And you're sort of made to memorize just a couple of assumptions before, that you need before you can move on to the more complex theory. And one of those assumptions is more is better. And it's like, in the first week of your education to learn about the economy and economics and what it means to be an economist, you learn to rely on this assumption of more is better. And it's why we're so passionate about this idea of changing education, because as you say, we're not even looking for something so radically different. People already have their own ideas of a new story, and it's just about saying what should grow. As you say, it doesn't necessarily have to be just material growth and things getting bigger. It could be growth in so many other things, and people already have these opinions, but we just need to change the way that it's talked about. And I know that from a rethinking economics perspective, a large part of that is just changing the way that we educate economists so that the narrative around the economy can just become about something else. I don't know if you wanted to add.
Maybe adding not only educating economists, but how we are all brought up by each other and by society. I mean, when I went to school, I have this memory of being a kid, and it was always a discussion of trying to save energy, trying to recycle, the climate change is happening, these kind of things. And it's a part of course, the formal education system, but it's also the people around you who are saying, okay, you have to switch off the light bulb when you leave the room, these kind of things. And I'm seeing this trend also European-wide. Of course, it's a question of what resources our generation we have, but it's also this kind of value. So if I could choose, what would I have? I wouldn't want to have a big house somewhere and 3 different cars and this kind of ideal that was the ideal maybe in the 60s or the 70s, but it's really having a small apartment somewhere and maybe more having the possibility to educate yourself and experience, maybe travel. Of course, traveling is also consuming, but I think it's a question of shifting the values also of what people want, even if they would have the possibility to choose, anything. And that really happens from the start, being aware of the fact that resources are limited.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, Sophie? Where's the microphone?
Thank Thank you. I just have that image of Yuan Yang in Hong Kong in my mind as well, and we haven't really spoken about the other side, other parts of the world and what the economic story is there, and how what we're talking about here are we talking globally, because we're in a very different position, both economically, financially. The conclusions that we're drawing are very located in our Western perspective of economics. And Kate, I wondered if you wanted to kind of touch on maybe Hong Kong, China, some of those developing economies.
So when I'm talking about economies that may have come towards the end of their growth, I'm definitely talking about economies here in Europe or maybe in the US. And you can pick them out because you can look at what are their current growth rates. Countries like France have maybe 1% growth going on, whereas actually the most dynamic countries in the world are places like Ethiopia, 7 to 10%. China has been the great, extraordinary, booming 7 to 10%, but it's come out of that and had to publicly announce we're downgrading the growth expectation, take that expectation off it. Now it's more like 7%, and even that might be an overestimate. So it's moving up that curve, right? This is the 7 to 10% shoot. And then you start moving up the curve. So yes, they are very, very different situations. In a way, I think that is one of the real ways we're hooked into growing. I call it the G20 family photo, right? Every year, the G20 leaders get together in the G20 photo, and it's the most proud photo to be in. Well, if you're not one of the biggest economies anymore, you might find yourself booted out by Vietnam or whoever's on the rise. So it's one of the reasons, it's a sort of geopolitical conspicuous consumption. Every country, no matter how wealthy it is today, needs to keep growing. Otherwise, you won't be invited to the next G20. And that's a really problematic political hook. I asked a friend of mine who teaches international political theory at the top university and said, well, this isn't on the radar because we still work within a frame of growth. So we're not even yet thinking about theories of how could we create geopolitical global governance that took into account some way of enabling countries that didn't have to continually grow, but recognizing that some are coming up. I think of it as mushrooms in a field. If you do a fast time motion of a video of mushrooms, they're popping up and down. You can think of national economies like that, and China is a giant mushroom coming up. So we're on very, very different trajectories, but that's partly what makes it so hard for other countries to let go.
Hi, I'm Tuukka from the UCL Institute for Global Prosperity, and all of this sort of makes me think of this idea of addiction. We obviously are addicted with certain indicators like GDP and economic growth, and what's the best way to get rid of a chocolate addiction? It's not to sort of deny that addiction completely, but it's sort of to replace the chocolate with something else, maybe carrots or something like that, whatever is your preference. So would it not be a good way forward to say that, okay, we love growth, we kind of like growth, but let's get rid of this single indicator and turn to plural indicators of well-being and turn to indicators that kind of show that we're doing better with nature and sustainability and so forth.
So you're saying we look at growth, but then we also look at other things alongside growth rather than just trying to dismiss growth. What do we think? Is there space for a bit of growth? Maybe? No one looks particularly enthusiastic. Yeah.
So I completely agree with the spirit of that intent. Look, we're hung up on this idea of growth. Forward and up is deeply ingrained in us. We need to reclaim the word and redefine it, and that's what a lot of people are trying to do. I don't think we're going to win that one. I just don't think we'll... Whatever you try to make grow, there comes a point where it shouldn't grow anymore. And the lady who was saying, how can we get over our thing about growth? I want to say, think of anything that you love and ask yourself what would happen if it grew indefinitely. It would just be destroyed. And the analogy that I try to come to is think of the human body. So we're all taught biology at school. Why aren't we taught Earth system science? Why don't we learn about the biology of the Mother Earth? But whenever you become a parent, or if you're aware of your own health, you know, when your child's temperature goes over 38 degrees, that's a fever. If your child's temperature goes over 40 degrees, you've really got to take action. You've got to bring that temperature back down. It's about balance. It's about keeping your heart rate in the right level of balance. It's about keeping your salt intake. It's too much, too little. It goes back to ancient philosophy. So actually, at the personal level, we deeply, deeply understand balance. So I think the The profound shift will be if we could start to think of an economy, and not just an economy, but in society, within the living world, all being in balance together. That's why I drew a picture that looks like a donut, which is about balance. It's this feel, not this feel.
In terms of being number 1 or 2 or 3, in terms of balancing, right? It might be fine to use competition as a motivating tool, right? So setting aside the idea of growth for a moment, we can still compete, right? We can try to be the best country within the donut, right?
Yeah.
Like balancing. So maybe that would be a nice substitute for
But of course,
obsession with growth.
When anything's in balance, if you want anything to be in balance, you really want to watch out for the weakest link because it's all connected. So if countries got incredibly competitive and said, we're the best national donut, then you've got a problem with the weakest link, which is why you see huge floods of people trying to come into Europe. So you have to care about the whole. It's on micro-national levels, but also the whole being in balance. That's the state that would be, to me, progress. Some people say the word progress is wrong. I think I can see a hell of a lot of space for progress from where we are now. So I'm all for progress if it can take us towards that balanced space.
Okay, thanks very much.
The day when we have a national donut competition. Can we at the back? Yeah.
Hello, I'm a project manager in the NHS. I think there is an alternative to growth. I think that growth is upon us. It's not something we can do without. It's happening without our control. I don't think we have to try and rise up to meet that growth with things. I think that actually, without meaning to come across cliched, I think it's about quality, not quantity. I think it's about embedding quality in everything that we do, and we have the foundation and the infrastructure already there. We don't need to recreate something that isn't there. We can embed quality in our relationships, in our systems, in our policies, in the way that we talk to each other, the way that we design systems. And it seems to me that there is always this need to try and match the growth that's happening, but actually I think we need to try and rein it back in and make something worthwhile of what we have already. And actually I think quality of what we're doing is often lost. It's all about expanding, getting bigger and better, but we thin out. We become spread out so thin when we do that, and actually we lose what's really important. So I think that actually just building quality into what we do is actually really the point of what you're saying. There is an alternative to growth. It isn't just about moving towards it, but it's about building capacity into what we already have. And I think there's so much potential within that that's often lost, and we don't harness that enough.
Thanks. I think that's a really important point, Johanna. I think this links as well to what you were saying about just this fear in Europe that somehow there isn't enough space and that somehow we can't be letting more people in because we don't have enough to share, and how flawed that is, I think. And it kind of links to what you're saying in that we seem to have this idea that there's just this limited quantity and we want to just make it bigger so that there's enough for everyone, when that isn't perhaps the right perspective. I don't know whether you...
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's really a question of coming back to something as basic as human rights. The last years we haven't been hearing a lot about rights-based approach or really looking at human rights and seeing the conditions people are living in Europe, but also all around the world. And I think that the different indicators we can have, I kind of agree with your comment saying, yes, maybe growth can continue to some extent, but we just have to make sure that we are making that shift and really bringing in the question of values into this whole discussion, because at the moment there's not a lot of discussions about values in society. It's kind of the value discussion is somewhere here, and then the economic discussion is here. When somebody comes out with his red bag in front of him, that's not a question of values anymore, that's a question of plus and minus and making it all add up in the end. And I think integrating those together, that's the key.
Absolutely, and I think this links, Kate, to what you said just about the economists' understanding of growth. And just, it's something that I know that Stuart talks about a lot as well, is just the idea that economics has somehow managed to present itself as a discipline that is value-free. And growth, therefore, as an economic concept, can be seen as value-free. And it seems really mad that narrative has been created. And I think one thing we haven't really touched on is how this narrative has been created. And I don't know if you could shed a bit of light on how you think just the economic discipline even, or whoever else has been involved in creating it, has managed to bring us to this situation where we are actually even setting a title such as, wait, is there an alternative to this imperative? It's almost like, when did this become an imperative in the first place?
Well, okay, so I would say how did that little sleight of hand happen that all that we value is monetary growth? And the nub of it was in Nick's story, that the dad is saying to Sasha, you see, there's value and there's meaning. And that's the moment to me where economics said utility. We need to pin down something non-judgmental, right? Your utility might be different from my utility. It doesn't matter because it's expressed in the marketplace when you buy things. And that's how we know what you value, when you buy. And it comes back to having indicators, actually. I love indicators. I drew the donut with indicators, but there's a danger of them that you only start to measure you only start to count what you can measure. And so we can only know somebody's utility by what they purchase, and that's how much they value it. And that's the moment a sudden elision happens. Because the lady was talking about quality. I absolutely agree. If we can bring quality into our relationships, we could have a huge growth in quality. For me, one of the tricky problems, or the nub of it, is economic growth needs to capture quality in monetary terms, right? GDP growth is a reflection of the value of goods and services sold. So if you go out for a meal with your friends, that meal is registered as the cost of the food. But actually what you were really going for was the great conversation. And an even more frightening world than the one that Nick was just describing, where all the natural capital is rustling, is where we quantify and value that conversation and pay for that value of the conversation. I'm slightly terrified because it's not very far away, because we all have these little debit cards that we just do touch, right? I mean, all it takes is just have a little thing here, and I say, Nick, that was a great point. Pound. I just touch, right?
It's already happening. I mean, there's like the idea of rating everything, giving everything stars, and this is kind of inevitably becoming more and more about rating people. There was some app recently that I think it was pulled because it was just too horrible, even for like today's world, where you could rate people on a kind of scale, and
I thought that was the beginning of Facebook.
Basically the same thing, yeah, but even more explicit.
Yeah.
Can I just something about that you said about growth being value free? Seemed, I mean, it almost sounds good. If you think of kind of, we've gone through the 20th century, been these horrific ideological struggles, maybe that is part of the appeal. You can think of things in terms of numbers. It's this kind of mathematical world where people's passionate opinions aren't causing mass deaths. And it ties in with that kind of end of history idea after the Berlin Wall fell, that a lot of people really wanted to believe that we're not having these violent struggles anymore. We're just going to think about the market, and we're going to think about numbers. I can kind of see the appeal of that story.
Yeah, it sounds a lot easier, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Less complicated than talking about all this feeling and value stuff.
And it's become, we've reached the point, as you said, where we've stopped seeing it as a story. It's just, is there an alternative?
Yeah, absolutely.
We have to ask that question because it doesn't seem obvious.
Yeah. So if there are any more points in the audience that maybe here, yeah. Just.
Hello. Does it work?
Yeah.
Just coming back to what you said about, so you're asking us to how it's come to be that we attach these value with monetary indicators and utility of people. And the question that I was thinking of is, that relates to that is why? At the heart of what I'm thinking is why.
Anyone got it?
Do you want to? Okay.
Well,
go on.
my instinct as to what's at the crux of what we've been talking about is some kind of collective trauma. Why as humans we are, like, we bring this idea of addiction, or we want to move into a world where we're actually going to value conversation, or we're going to put stars against everything that we do, or a tag or a monetary value on everything. But why? Why is that the direction that we're heading? Why are we having, it's just the question that I think you were trying to get to, is why are we on this trajectory of permanent growth, and why do we have to have the conversation about, is there an alternative?
Yeah, it is almost just what is good about, or where is the appeal in this word and in this concept, I suppose.
One of the reasons I think why is because when you put a monetary value on something and it goes into the monetary exchange market, value, the only value that can be captured is monetized value, right? So if you have a fantastic night out with your friends, I can't capture the value of that unless I sell you tickets to get into the place in the park where you go. I try to talk to my kids about this. So I live in Oxford, and we have May morning every May morning, 6 o'clock in the morning. We all dress up in green and sing in the and look crazy. And we're living in the Commons, right? It's part of the Commons. It's a cultural celebration. And my kids have been doing it since they were tiny, and they love it. And I said to them, how would you feel if this year we go to the centre of town and there's a big cordon around the centre of town? You have to pay £5 to get in. They were really shocked, the idea. I didn't know, nobody can do that because they don't own May morning. I said, exactly, nobody owns that. But if they monetised it, they could capture the value of May morning, which is part of the Commons. We create masses of value all the time in our lives, in conversations with friends, in celebrating May morning, in having your allotment with friends. It's all outside the monetary economy. So nobody can capture it. It's reaped only by commoners who create it. But once you monetize things, that value can be captured by others. That's Marx's whole point about capturing the value of labour, and it can be accumulated. So in terms of governments need to capture value because they need tax, and business needs to capture value because it's trying to make a profit. So I think of both business and government having an interest in monetising the commons, like the living world, as Nick wrote about, natural capital. Once you put a price on it, you start to be able to accumulate it. When it's not priced, it's wonderful value and quality in the commons. So for me, a really big part of escaping from this growth mentality is rediscovering the commons and realising it's all around us and protecting it. Because it's huge value, it's a wonderful part of our lives that we can grow, but it doesn't show up in the monetary economy, and we've got to protect it.
Definitely. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I think we can take just another question. Yes. Well, then I think it's going to be you.
I was going to ask two quick questions. One's directed at Johanna. My name is Astrid Alban, and I'd like to ask you, you spoke about fear, and a lot of fear being making the younger generation apathetic. And my question to you is, what do you think is needed to take away that fear? That's one question. Second question, let's say we have this new narrative. So it's no more we have to, but we already have a large part of this new narrative. How would you get it out, and to whom?
Starting with the fear, I think it boils down to giving us opportunities to feel that we can build a stable life, or we can build some kind of life out of this. And of course, it goes on, and if you continue the question, how can this be done? How can we get jobs? It's a very complex question. It's a question of job creation and growth that we are having here. But I think eradicating that fear is really about somebody in leading positions in society, politicians, or the people creating the narrative, really giving us those answers. This is how we can sustainably supply our society with jobs. Is that, for example, that everybody would work 5 hours per day and we would kind of share the jobs we are having? Or is that really looking into new sectors and trying to create new things that we share or create added value for us as human beings or societies, and that way creating societies that actually make sense also for our generation. But what is clear is we cannot continue in the old way where kind of everybody above 30 or 35 has a very stable and good life situation, and then our generation coming on and kind of not having a lot. There was a point in 2007 where suddenly the group in society all over Europe that was the demographic group that had the biggest chance of falling into poverty was young people, no longer old, lonely people, but young people. And this is just continuing since 2007, and it's getting worse and worse all the time. So it's really about somebody coming and telling that first, we are valued as a group, and secondly, that there is actually something to live for. And then I'm not saying something super fancy and luxurious. It's really about having a house, education, health, family, job.
So I think that's partly addressing the second question as well, isn't it, in terms of how you get a new narrative out. It is partly about just the leaders in society taking on that responsibility. I don't know if you wanted to add, just, I think that's a nice question to round it off. How do we get a new narrative out, and to who? Nick?
I'm afraid I'm just going to kind of semi-repeat what I said before about this idea of exploiting the cracks that have started to appear in other people's narratives, narratives that people have believed all their lives and now seem increasingly unlikely. And rather than that, them just being left with this kind of despairing gulf where there's no narrative, that's the space to start putting other ones in.
On the point of where's the new narrative come from? So I studied economics at university 20 years ago, like Victoria, except she didn't do it 20 years ago, and came away deeply frustrated because I felt that most of the things that I cared about were just... Yes, no, so I'm getting there. So I felt deeply frustrated because it left out most of the things I cared about. I walked away from it. I'm not an economist. I never identified as an economist. Went to work for not the World Bank, the UN, for Oxfam, and eventually realized you just can't escape from this thing because it is the language of public policy. So my own personal therapy has been to come back towards it and throw myself back into it. I'm writing a book about, at the moment, 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist, thinking of the students who today go into studying economics. I admire them hugely. Economics means household management. These are people who say, look at the state of this household. I think I'm up for trying to help manage it. And they damn well deserve to be given a 21st century way of thinking, which is grounded in values, which is grounded in complex systems, which isn't still selling them off and fobbing them off with 19th century ideas or 20th century growth addiction. So I'm passionate about doing that. The way I'm trying to do it is through drawing new pictures. I think the words and the pictures that we see go right in the back of our head without us realizing how they shape us. So I don't think we can write a new narrative unless we draw the pictures that go with it. So I want to take that to the economics students, but of course it has to go into the media, it has to go into politicians, and I think they're hungering for new words. When you hear politicians talk about growth, they can't just say that word anymore. They say green growth, sustainable growth, long-term lasting growth, because they know that word doesn't work anymore, but there's no alternative. Writing this book, I've tried very hard not to use the word natural resources. It is so hard because we don't have other words. So I use the phrase the living world, for example. And as Stuart said earlier, you feel like you're sounding fluffy. It's not fluffy. It's real. It's values, actually. You have to not be afraid to speak of values and to speak of the living world and speak of relationships and not be drawn always to speak in the language of power, which is natural capital and ecosystem services. That's power today, but if you've got your eye on the long view, we really need to reinvent the language around it.
Thank you. Great. So I think we've all come away with quite a lot of ideas from this conversation today. I feel like what we just keep revisiting is this question of the language of education, of the way that we talk about it, and of exploiting this old story and bringing in the story that we all kind of want to be telling. As this is the free word, this is the place to bring literary voices into political conversation, and so it's only appropriate that we'll end on another poem. We're really happy to be joined by Antosh today, who is a resident artist at the Roundhouse and part of several poetry collectives as well, and he's going to share a poem with us to this question of whether there is an alternative.
Hello. It's been like listening to poetry the entire time being here. Thank you so much for accepting me in this space, the cultural representation. Actually, but this is the thing, it's amazing listening to economists and everyone here. They all have a very specific poetry in which they talk about these terms. And I was very scared when I was offered this commission because I was like, economy and poetry. It's a very interesting world to want to be an artist and to live through all the things that we see often. And in terms of economy, it's a real intense time. I'm like, I wish I could just pay my council tax with just writing them a poem and that'd be enough for the month, So coming to this writing a poem for this was a real big question in terms of what I thought of growth. I'm Polish by heritage, but I'm terrible at being a Polish person. I can't speak a word of it, and I've never been there. I will go there for the first time in April, which will be lovely. But I'm 24, and that's quite a long time to have not really embraced even the beginning of my family kind of thing on one side. And my dad has never taught me Polish because he put it even in economic value. He was like, it's not going to get you a job. It's not going to get you any money. I'm not going to teach you it. I didn't ever see the value in teaching you it. And it was like, but there's so much more it could have given me. But, and at the same time, there's a kind of economy in death that I wanted to explore, which is, I know, quite a big term, but the rates in which we kill lots of people and how people die as well, there's a kind of a loss of heritage that we lose. And I think sometimes with growth, it means expansion, and that means kind of erasing cultures that we then lose a heritage tied to. So that is a preamble to this poem. It is entitled, "Is that rope you're pulling on, or your lover, or the border of that forgotten place?" "We should have put the flat cap on the coffin," my brother says, "while we wait for the Irish priest to pronounce the holy demolition. And we time our unsinging, and I see Dad's dad run with Dad and my brother through a field, and I'm not there. I'm operating the camera on this occasion and holding the hand of the woman I love. She calls me Rope. Dad's laugh is trapped in his daughters. They call his heart saint for the patience. His wife brings up her war, how her country is forgot now that we drop unnamed gunpowder urns on a country whose people are trying to escape. She calls these people immigrants, even though they are her in their war, just decades on, still playing wartime, impersonating aeroplanes falling into the snow to eat it. The man she loved, she called Rope, his knotted brain dislocated from all places, his language. I asked if he wanted to see Poland again, to see home, and by home he just meant his family running through a field. Dad buried a language inside me. I cannot escape to anywhere but here. In the event I am dropped from a plane with the woman I love who calls me Rope, she could be mistaken as gunpowder and me the carrier. Mum hands me Dad's dad in a jar in a carrier bag. His powder existence is about as heavy as my bicycle. We don't know how to get him into his home country. They might suspect us carrying someone mistaken as gunpowder onto a plane, Mum says. We could store the ash in hollow appendages or drop him from a plane in his own named gunpowder urn. It would crash through an abandoned roof of a country we emptied, the gone people mistaken as gunpowder as they escaped to a country they were promised refuge. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That's unfortunately the end of the conversation, but I believe there is a reception just outside where we can all continue the conversation. So just for now, another thank you to our speakers and to Antosh and to all of you.